Hey guys, it's Josh. You're probably hearing about the Sahm Rule everywhere you turn these days, and with good reason. We have Claudia Sahm today on the show. Stick around. We'll figure out what's going on together. At public.com, you can earn 5.1% APY with a high yield cash account. That's not just a good rate, it's literally an industry-leading rate. Plus, no fees, zero, so you can maximize your interest. What's the point of earning a high yield if you have to spend a bunch of it on fees? At public.com, it's just 5.1% APY, straight up, no strings attached, and no balance requirements. Use as little or as much of a deposit as you'd like. This is a paid endorsement for public investing, 5.1% APY as of June 17th, 2024, and is subject to change. Full disclosures in the podcast description. Good afternoon, everyone. Here with Claudia Sahm today on a tumultuous day in the market and a fun-filled, volatile day overall in the headlines. Claudia, thank you so much for doing this. I'm going to read your bio very quickly, and then we'll get right into it. Claudia is the chief economist at New Century Advisors, the founder of Sahm Consulting, and the creator of the Sahm Rule, which is said to be an early recession indicator. Claudia, you are on fire right now. How does it feel to be the biggest celebrity in economics in the summer of 2024?
Well, first, thank you for having me. And it would feel better if it were for a good reason. Right? So to have a recession indicator and to have it had triggered, well, I'm sure we're going to talk about what that means, is, not the reason to be in the spotlight, but I'm here to be helpful. That's why I created this indicator. We'll talk about its origins, but it's kind of a moment.
Yeah. So I've been around for a long time, and I had not heard about the Sahm Rule, but apparently it's something that you created in 2019. The first person to mention it to me was Nick Colas, which he did on the show. And I guess it had a lot of relevance to start talking about now because we're trying to figure out if the Fed is staying too tight and if the economy the good economy we've had is going to start slipping away before the Fed can start easing. And that's why everyone's talking about the Sahm Rule. I want to try to explain it very succinctly, and you tell me if I'm missing anything about how the Sahm Rule works. That's important to the discussion. The Sahm Rule is a recession indicator. You came up with it about 5 years ago. And basically what you're doing is calculating the 3-month moving average of the national unemployment rate. So not just last month's print, but you'll take the last 3. You'll average those, and you're comparing them to the lowest 3-month moving average for the unemployment rate that we've had over the last 12 months. So I have that. So far. Okay, you're nodding.
Yeah, that's the formula. We're there.
Okay, if the current 3-month average is 0.5 percentage points or more above the lowest 3-month average from the last 12 months, that would signal the early stages of a recession. We could talk about how early, but that would be the quote unquote trigger. And I'm so excited to have you on today because as of the last employment report we got, the 3-month average is now more than just barely 0.5% above the lowest 3-month average that we've had. Therefore, the Sahm Rule is in effect. We all need to put on our helmets, and you tell me what we do next. Now, what do we do?
Right. So I think, backing up to why does the Sahm Rule exist? So I started at the Federal Reserve in the summer of 2007. So my first forecast, whereas the 2008 recession had begun and the Fed went into, recession forecasting mode, I studied the fiscal response in addition to the monetary policy response through the Great Recession. And honestly, it was lacking, particularly on the fiscal side. And that caused a lot of damage. I'm expert on consumers, households. And that was something that both in my research and policy work, including after I left the Fed, has been a big focus. The reason the Sahm Rule exists, I didn't name it. It was totally a supporting actress in the study where it was shown up, was the idea of when we are in a recession, let's get the government to commit to doing fiscal policy, well designed, effective, figured out ahead of time, and have them commit to hitting go as soon as the macroeconomic conditions warrant it. Right. So the
So
whole
you went
idea
in
is
search for what would be the sign that it's time to go?
yes, and the sign, and I was very specifically looking at fiscal policy that should you if you are going to give hundreds of billions of dollars to people in the effort to stabilize the economy, you should do it when the economy needs stabilizing. So high bar on it's in a recession. And so this was very much looking back over history where all the different episodes of recessions. We've had many different kinds of recessions in the post World War II period. We have all these dates. And so I was very much looking at the history. What is a formula? Knowing that changes in the unemployment rate are a very powerful dynamic, right? Like that shows
Yeah.
up in the Sahm Rule. It shows up. There's other people who do forecasting. I didn't invent the US labor market dynamics. I'm just capturing it. But that exact, what's the formula and what's the threshold came from I want to find an indicator that turns on as soon as possible in a recession, because that's when you have a chance to do some good, but in a recession. No false
So
positives. But
so
that's not where
so
we are now.
so according to your work, the Sahm rule, I guess on a back test, um, would have accurately signaled every actual recession we've had since the 1970s without the false positives that can occur outside of recessions. Um, this is in some ways similar to my friend Professor Cam Harvey, who was trying to figure out, why the inverted yield curve has been so accurate in predicting recessions, and so far has not had a false positive either. Some would say recent history has been the false positive, but he would argue I'm still on the clock. But it's interesting that you created this for fiscal policy while working at the Fed.
Right. So as the analyst, one of the analysts who covered consumer spending in 2008, understanding what consumers were doing with their, say, rebate checks or later tax credits, the Fed works around the edges. In the staff's
Yeah.
forecast, there are estimates of what fiscal policy does the economy, and the Fed can take that into consideration when they do their monetary policy. So yeah, it does. It may seem a little counterintuitive, but that's a very important piece of the health of the economy, understanding consumers. But I will say, having watched that episode made me want to help improve the policy for next time. The summer was part of a policy volume in early 2019 on how to all kinds of automatic stabilizers. It was just a piece of it. And, it comes from the back test, right? I'm looking at history before that. It did pass the 2020, calling that recession with flying colors, but anyone could have done that.
Yes.
And yet there are some very unusual circumstances in this cycle. The Sahm Rule, in my opinion, I do not think the US economy is in a recession, despite what the Sahm Rule is stating right now. And yet it is in a long line of indicators and rules of thumb that have fallen victim. The closest comparison to the Sahm Rule is not the yield curve. The yield curve is a forecast. Again, the Sahm Rule, if we're not in a recession, it's off the cloud. It's failed. I mean, I think it still tells us
Yeah.
something. But but the two consecutive quarterly declines in GDP, real GDP, is the most famous and well-known recession indicator. It's even called a
Yeah.
technical recession.
Unfortunately, you find out much later that you're
We
in
find
one.
out much later. That's why I didn't use it for my proposal. That's why I
Right.
needed something came faster with the Sahm Rule. And yet in the first half of 2022, we had two declines in GDP and no recession. You have to go
And no
back to
recession.
1947 to find that in the US.
Let's put this chart up, John. So this is what the real-time Sahm Rule indicator would look like. We're using Fred data. This is not my chart, but this is a version of the chart that you're seeing pop up everywhere. So you just mentioned the 2020 example. Obviously, that's not subtle. That's the greatest spike in unemployment of all time. Let's hope of all time in such a short compressed period. What's happening right now is subtle. We've just inched above this quote unquote trigger. We're at 0.53 versus 0.500
Mhm.
or 50 or half a percent. Is there anything wrong with thinking about this chart this way? Would you not put it together this way for some reason? Or would you say this is a pretty accurate idea of what the trigger looks like in the data?
Yeah, no, I mean that's the real time Sahm Rule. I do like using the back testing was done with the real time data, just meaning that I have used the unemployment rate as it was published at the time. The unemployment rate
Okay.
does revise a little bit with the seasonals, so that's and the two false positives for the real time Sahm Rule come in prior to 1970, and in both cases followed shortly thereafter by a
Okay.
recession. And there's a
So
real
the
close one in 75. So I don't want to get into like the false precision of it either, right? And it is dancing right
right.
around the point 0.5 and it is just a historical pattern. But yes, this shows this is the indicator.
Well, but doesn't it look like, I'm sorry, if we put it up one more
Mhm.
time, doesn't it look like that 0.5 is a point of no return? It's it's almost never or never in the period that we're studying here reversed itself without the recession. So, I mean, that's worth noting, right?
There's a reason that this indicator has gotten attention. Right?
Yeah,
I put it I did not, again, have my forecaster hat on when I was
right.
putting this on. There are I mean, on Wall Street, Goldman's had a version of it, Bill Dudley, like, people that, like, once you get up to a third of a percentage point increase, you need to define how the increase is exactly, maybe differently, but that has a really high chance of a recession.
Yeah.
So I put a very high bar, what I thought would be a very high bar to keep out the false positives. And and yet I think when to get to this conversation about why it may not be sending the same signal as it has in the past, you have to go in under the hood. Like, this is a very simple rule, simple by construction. Again, it was supposed to be for fiscal policy. This would be some fancy whiz bang model. This was going to go in legislation. And it's a victim to its simplicity because there are things going on under the hood in terms of the unemployment rate in the United States that are not the recessionary dynamics, and I think
Yeah.
could reverse, and that's what has to happen. The unemployment rate
The
comes straight.
pandemic effectively broke every economic indicator in some way, some worse than others. But some economic indicators or rules of thumb that we used to rely upon for 100 years became completely invalid because of how weird that A, shutdown was, and then B, the reopen made things even stranger. And so I think a lot of things like just the reliability of the way that we thought the economy worked absolutely was altered. And you've been pointing this out in your public appearances. So, what is it about the current state of unemployment where you say, "Hey guys, not so fast. Things might be a little bit different this time"?
Right. So there are two kind of basic reasons the unemployment rate goes up. One, there's a weakening demand for workers. Unemployment rate goes up. That's very consistent with, recessionary dynamics. That's bad.
Sure.
That's the power, and it builds. There's momentum. That's where the Sahm Rule gets its accuracy from historically. The other reason that you can have the unemployment rate increase is if you have an increase in the supply of workers.
Okay.
And in general, the unemployment rate can get pushed around. It's even worse right now for the Sahm Rule because we had early in the pandemic, we had millions of workers drop out of the labor force, like just walk away. Then we ended up because not they can't, didn't all come back as quickly as say customers did. So we had labor shortages. The unemployment rate got pushed down, probably unsustainably because we just didn't have enough workers. And then in recent years, we've had a surge in immigration, as well as we had a good labor market, so people were coming in from the sidelines. So not only we've had two rather notable changes in the labor supply, and that I think as we've learned, and this is like a broad lesson from this, is anytime we have really abrupt dramatic changes, the adjustments can take a long time. And so now as we have these immigrants coming in, is solving the labor shortage. That is a very good thing. Having a larger labor force, particularly as we have many people aging out, that helps keep us growing. That's a good thing. But in the interim, where they're still searching for jobs, things have slowed down some in terms of
Yeah.
adding jobs. That causes the unemployment rate to drift up. Now, if it's just about that supply adjustment, it's temporary. And
Yeah.
at the end of it, it's a good thing because we've got more workers. But that's the typically, and we've had recessions when there were expansions in the labor force, like in the 1970s. So I don't want to act like, oh, just because we have more workers now, everything is okay. It's just the Sahm rule. And again, as you point out, it's just right at the cusp of its trigger, its historical trigger. It's got a lot going on under the hood. There
Yeah.
clearly
Well,
are
it's a
weakening,
denominator
but there's
that changes.
supply.
Is a
Yes.
denominator. The people that are listed as being available in the labor force does not stay static. And so the numerator moves, of course, the unemployment, the unemployment number itself, but then it's a rate, it's a percentage of, and the thing it's a percentage of is also moving.
Right. Now
Okay.
it can get very complicated, but essentially the big piece that is making the current reading of the Psalm roll is too ominous because
Yeah.
it's folding in that increase in the supply of workers, which is a good thing, and it's like marking it down as a bad thing. Now the question,
Yeah.
and this to your thing about all these indicators that have had a lot of trouble, we've got both things going on here, right? So I look at this summer and I said it broke in the sense of being a recession indicator because we know so much else about the US economy that like right now we are not in a contraction. The Sahm rule typically turns on 3 months into an MBR dated recession. No. Like that's not where and yet there is enough weakening. There's enough of that unemployment rate drift that's coming from less slowing demand for workers that raises risks of a recession 3 months, 6 months, like, down the
So
roads.
So I want to show you a dialogue that
Mhm.
took place the other day that I think encapsulates the debate around the Psalm rule itself and how useful it is now versus in past instances. So here's a tweet from David Rosenberg. And David says, the Psalm rule triggered the recession call today. The chart here shows that the 80 basis point jump in the jobless rate over the past year is a 100, these are his words, 100% ironclad indicator that the downturn has either arrived or about to. The Fed is as behind the economic curve now as it was behind the inflation curve back in 21, 22. Most of this tightening phase and cyclical bear market in bonds is set to unwind in dramatic fashion. And he posts a chart of the Sahm rule triggering, which the response. So this is Barry Ritholtz, my partner, full disclosure, and he's friends with Dave, so it was a conversation. But he says the Sahm. I want you to judge what in here is right, what in here is wrong. The Sahm rule was designed to identify in real time when a recession had begun by measuring an uptick in layoffs. It has never signaled a recession from unemployment levels this low or from an increase in unemployment levels caused by a rise in labor force participation. At Claudia Sahm, he gave you a shout out,
Mhm.
inventor of the rule, has said she doesn't think the current measure is indicating a recession yet. For those people who have been incorrectly rooting for recession for 2 years, they imagine it's manna from heaven. More likely, it's going to extend their losing forecast record. So that's David Rosenberg and Barry Ritholtz, and not necessarily one versus the other, but like, what do you take away from that disagreement? Because that's what's everywhere right now.
Yeah, no, Barry texted me that after he tweeted it.
Well, I'm sure he did.
And so, no, I think it's, uh so I am, and I mean, I'm still with, Barry in that we are not in a recession. A recession is not my base case right now.
Okay.
The odds of it are rising. A very key part of it not becoming my base case is the fact that not only does the Fed have sufficient room to ease, I expect them to begin easing, not
Okay.
before
Oh,
September,
so let me.
but like I do expect them. So, but there's all these details. I will say one thing because there were a lot of like little details of like Rosie didn't. That's not exactly how the Somme rule is calculated. I do let it things can drift up over time. So it's only a
He
1
did
year
say
look back.
100% ironclad.
And
I don't know.
not the Sahm rule itself, even the real time has false positives. And then just this bigger conversation of history might not repeat. The one thing on berries is there are cases, you have to go further back in history. There are times where we go into a recession with a low or lower unemployment rate than now. It is not recent, right? Like, so there's all these, and we have a mix. I talked a lot about like the labor supply. That's definitely in the mix. We've had, I spent some time looking at, okay, that Sahm Rule, that 0.5, when we get across that threshold, what do the contributions from different types of unemployed? Like you can be because you were laid off, which, Barry mentioned being laid off. You could be because you're an entrant to the workforce, you left a job. We see quite a bit of variation, like the contributions. It is true right now we're much more, there's more of the entrance, the new job seekers, the coming back to the labor force. They're a bigger contributor to getting across that 0.5 threshold than say in the last, most recessions. But you go back to the 70s when the labor force, it's not that different. So it's hard to pull it out. I do think, like, I'm not in the ironclad. The recession is not a given, in nor I think what I read the history that tightly. And yet I think there are real risks. And as with Barry, I was say in 2022, oh, a recession is coming, or we need a recession. I was adamantly, I've never had a recession call in this whole time. I was kind of close when I got to Silicon Valley Bank, but I have not had a recession call in.
Good for you.
And part of what I could say in 2022 was look at the labor market, look at consumers, and I can't, it's not, we are still in a position of strength, but much less. And the momentum is not good.
We're at 3.6% unemployment and retail sales increasing at an average of 2.5% a month. You can't say that that's a recession, and it turned out not to have been, as much as a lot of people thought, well, we're due or it should happen. I want to ask you one more thing. The irony of the way that you've constructed the Sahm Rule is if the fiscal authorities, Congress, God forbid, listen to you, and you said, hey guys, we have a triggering of my eponymous rule. Therefore, you should be doing something for the people most vulnerable on the stimulative side. If they listen to you and do it quickly, your rule will then be proved false because we'll avoid the recession. You have to be okay with that. It's like, hey, they listened to me and the trigger turned out to be a false trigger because fiscal spending offset the potential recession. Or is that a little bit too like superhero saves the day kind of thing?
I was going to say, I'm not expecting that. I'd take it. If it breaks for did a good thing. I'm more concerned that, having a recession indicator that in the past has been very accurate, but likely is having some trouble right now, is fueling or helping to feed the fears about the economy. Like this is exactly the setup that I would not, it's exactly the setup I was trying to avoid by being very like, we're well inside the recession, we hit go. But, like I and anyone else who does policy advising learned just an immense amount of humility from making an immense amount of mistakes and thinking about how to do this. So no, I wouldn't go back and do it the same. The Sahm Rule is the intent of it was to encourage fiscal action. I think the maybe a irony of it is, it may help encourage monetary policy is the one that has the lever right now to pull. And frankly, the Fed should be forward looking. If they were going to act to support the labor market, waiting until we are in a recession is actually kind of waiting too long.
Well, unfortunately, we had the Dow fall 1,000 points at the open, in part because that's basically what people believe the Fed is now on track to do. They really, really want to see the whites of the eyes of the recession before firing, I suppose. Some people are being more hysterical about it than others, but you have been incredibly even-keeled. And anytime I see you on the screen, I turn the volume on. I want to hear what you have to say. And I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the compound and explaining how this all really works to the audience. I know it's much appreciated out there. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. All
right, Claudia, we'll talk to you again soon. I want to tell people how they can follow you. You are doing the Twitter. You are at Claudia _ Sahm, SAHM, and your website, claudiasahm.com. Pretty easy to find you, right?
Yep, that's right.
All right, guys. Follow Claudia for the real Sahm and the real Sahm Rule in real time. All right, we're out. We'll talk to you guys soon. Thank you.